We are now being recorded. Again, welcome everyone. SIETAR Europa December webinar with Kirsten Wächter, entitled Challenging Our Perception, Tools to Overcome Cultural Stereotypes. I'm absolutely delighted to host the webinar with Kirsten today. I met Kirsten in November of 2014 on a streetcar in Bonn, Germany. Turns out we were headed to the same conference, and little did I know what really a life-changing moment that was, because our paths have crossed regularly since then, and I just admire Kirsten's energy and creativity and enthusiasm for everything that she does. Professionally, she is a trainer in the area of cross-cultural communications and communication skills. She does a lot of trainer work, and she supports our community in virtual communications and presentations. Again, I'm extremely delighted and honored that I can join this with Kirsten today. And with that, I am just going to turn it over to you, Kirsten. Take it away.
Okay, thanks a lot, Steve. So it was a life-changing moment, I suppose, for both of us, so because I also enjoy working with you. So hello, everybody. And first of all, can you just put in the chat box if you can hear me okay? So if you cannot see me okay, that's not a problem, but you should be able to hear me okay. Wonderful. Okay, so I won't look at the list, but I can see some of the people in the chat box, and I already know that I know some of the people, so the pressure is on me now. Good. So we're going to start with a little quiz, actually with a little joke. So maybe you know this already. So you have the choice between heaven and hell, and heaven is where what is British, what is French, what is German, what is Italian, and what is Swiss, or who are, and what is hell. Don't put the answers into the chat box because it will take ages, but just think about this for yourself. Where would you put the cooks, the mechanics, the police, the lovers, and the organizers? Well, just give you a minute. The answer to this is, of course, stereotypes, right? So heaven is where the police are British, the cooks are French, the mechanics are German, the lovers are Italian, and it's all organized by the Swiss. Hell is where the police are German, the cooks are English, the mechanics are French, the lovers are Swiss, and it's all organized by the Italians. And that's, of course, something that's funny, and we say maybe there's a grain of truth in this, yeah, and maybe you recognize your own national stereotype, but actually this is where the problem starts, because how true are these stereotypes and how much do they change and influence the way we see other people? So I give you another one. Would you say that these are stereotypes? Hindus are vegetarians, women are weak, lawyers are greedy, and Spaniards are proud. So what would you say? All of them? Yeah. So again, they are. Not all Hindus are vegetarians. It's just they don't eat beef for religious reasons. For centuries, men told women they are weak. They tried to find scientific evidence in the 19th century to prove that we have smaller brains and therefore can't be as intelligent and as strong as men. Yeah? So Spaniards are proud. This is something that comes up again later, and lawyers are greedy. Why do we have these stereotypes? Yeah. So not only some, Christina, not only some. So why do you have these stereotypes? Steve, I think you're still, your sound is still on. So because I think I can hear your keyboard typing, or it's somebody else. Thank you. So, and Spaniards are proud, which comes from somewhere. And you think that's something, a thing of the past. Christina just pointed out, no, it's not. And no, it isn't. So I came across this advert at our SIETAR Europa conference in Leuven. This was the Dolce & Gabbana advert for China. They did a series of commercials with a very famous actress, and she tried to eat typical Italian food with chopsticks. The Chinese were not amused. They went livid. They went like, who do you think we are? Are we stupid? So this is actually an offense of our culture and everything. And they thought it was funny, but playing on stereotypes can backfire very easily and can still be seen as an offense. So what we are going to do today is actually not an academic webinar. I am a practitioner. I have a degree in English literature, media studies, and cultural studies, and I've been working with students at university and people in service, so working in companies for the last 20 years. And they are facing these issues. They behave without reflecting what they're going to say, what they're going to do, why they think of a person like this. And they work in international business. So my job is to take them through this journey and help them do better business by seeing what is going on here, what is going wrong, and how they can do this better. And what I'm going to do today is I give you a bit of input that you can also use with your students, why this is important, but we will focus on exercises that you can easily take into your classroom, and this is the first one. The exercises will be available. We upload the presentation to YouTube in the note view so that you can see my notes, which give instructions and explanations to the exercises. And this is my first exercise, which is future biographies. So what I do is I present these 4 pictures to my students and ask them to write up the biography for one of these 4 people. If you have a large group, you can also team them up and say, look at the biography for the little white girl, the little black girl, the little white boy, and the little black boy. And what do you think are typical biographies? What do you think are future job options? What will happen to these people? Any idea? Put it in the chat box. Maid, for example. Yeah. Would that be for the black or the white girl? The white boy could be a lawyer. Yeah, for the black girl. The white would be maybe a housewife. The young man, the black young man, Patrick, will become president of the US. You're close. So the 4 people, because of course, after you take them through the biographies they've written, you must tell them who these people are. The 4 people, priest, that's a nice option, are from top left, Amelia Earhart, the pilot and adventurer, Katherine Jackson, the woman who became famous through Hidden Figures, the movie about the NASA programmers that helped to send Apollo into space, Alan Turing, the famous homosexual mathematician, who actually invented modern programming, and Nelson Mandela, so not president of the US, but president of South Africa. And by doing this, then giving them the photos and let them research what really happened to the people, you already start breaking up the stereotypical perception. What happens to a white girl, to a black girl, to a white boy, and to a black boy? And you can take any pictures of famous people, and it's a very easy thing to do. And I would also say you can take this with any age group. So that's one of my favorite activities. Good. Why is it important to do that? Well, there's an organization, that's the World Economic Forum. You may be familiar with this. And every couple of years, they look into employability skills. What are the top employability skills for people? And these are the 2 years compared, 2015 and 2020. And you see that things like people management, critical thinking, which is very important, of course, judgment and decision making, and those kind of things, even though they are at different ranking from year to year, always end up in the top 10. And how do our students, how do we as trainers learn and improve our critical thinking skills? How do we improve our coordinating, our people management, our judgment and decision making if it's not reflecting on why we think the way we do and what we can do to improve that and how we can foster better collaboration? So that is actually something very important. Now, for critical thinking and problem solving, which are very important in international business, or when you teach students who work internationally, or when you teach, for example, doctors who need to work with international patients in your country, these things are very important too. So you need to reason effectively. You need to be able to use systems thinking. You have to make judgments and decisions that are not based on value judgments, on stereotypes, on generalizations, and you need to be able to solve problems. And that would include, for example, that you ask better questions to clarify different points of view, to find better solutions. It also means that you need to reflect critically on your own learning experiences and your processes. Why was there a misunderstanding? And that's quite important. For those of you who, like me, also teach business communication or foreign languages, you might be familiar with the Council of European Framework of Reference for language learning. In the latest edition, which came out about 1.5 years ago, they finally included intercultural competence. So they came up with 6 levels of pluricultural competence, as they call it. And that's quite important for us as trainers, because it's one of the few attempts to think about what should that include. We're not going into detail because the whole thing is far too long. But if you have students who are at a kind of intermediate competence level when it comes to intercultural encounters, then they should be able to show awareness and think about that some questions that they ask may be perceived differently in the culture. And also some ideas that they have may be seen as offensive, for example. Yeah? They should also be able to act in a supportive manner in intercultural encounters, recognizing that their behavior is appropriate or maybe less appropriate, that people feel and see things differently. At the C1 and C2 level, that is the highest, the most advanced level for the CEFR, of course, you have different contributions. Ideally, we should be here as trainers. Yeah, we should be able to mediate effectively, naturally, between members of ourselves and other communities. Yeah, at least we should be able to act as intermediators in international encounters or intercultural encounters. And maybe we also want our students to get there, and then we have to think about how they can get there, and they only get there by asking questions, reflecting on their own behavior, and observe what's happening around them, and challenging their own worldview. So that was basically the theoretical input, and then we go back to practice. So, and the question is, of course, we talk about employability skills, but the people who recruit are also biased. They also have their own stereotypes. And this is another great activity you can easily adapt to the classroom. You just use the same CV, you give it a name from another culture, and you give it a name from your culture. And then you ask people who they would employ. The BBC did this as a real-life experiment. This was also shown in a workshop on unconscious bias in Leuven by Rob Gibson. So they had exactly the same CV, but one had a Muslim name and one had a typically English name. The English person got 3 times more invitations. So they sent this out to real recruiters, which is a great start to challenge people about bias, about stereotypes. Why did he get this? Because recruiters rather have English people in their company. They think they're going to work better. They think there will be less trouble. Yeah. So, and that's also something that you can just download very easily, the whole case study, the text from the website. Where do stereotypes come from? Well, in our latest SIETAR Europe journal, there's actually an article about Italy as seen from 3 expatriates, which is a very interesting article, and it all starts with Goethe. And Johann Wolfgang von Goethe lived in the 18th century, and at that time, the idea of describing cultures, ascribing national features and qualities to people came up. And Goethe also uses them to a certain extent when he describes Italian culture, even though his Italian journey is still one of the most fascinating travel records. And when we talk about the Spaniard, you remember on the 2nd or 3rd slide, I asked you if the Spaniards are proud as a stereotype, and you said yes. And this is the chart of people. And you see here, I'm sorry it's in German, but it is originally German, it's not translated. You see here the qualities for Spanish people that were ascribed to them. So on the one hand, they were seen as arrogant and very masculine, very macho. On the other hand, they were also seen as very educated because they were able to write, they were able to read, they had a high level of education and so on. And it sort of started all off as descriptions. But at some point, these descriptions were taken for granted. They became stereotypes. So whenever you see a Spaniard being portrayed in a German painting in the 19th century, or in a German movie or in German pop music, in the 20th century, you can be sure that these ideas of being very macho, enjoying party life, being quite arrogant and proud and so on, do play a part. This is a very interesting article for those who research on gender and stereotypes by Stephanie Bock. This is also freely downloadable in English because she did her whole thesis on this, and that was more or less her starting point. So why do we use stereotypes? Are they really bad? Bad? Well, yes and no. So stereotypes are not negative as such when they're used to describe a group, and to give them characteristics. And yes, they can provide orientation in complex situations when I travel or migrate to another country. But, and that's a big but, we all know that they very easily lead to prejudice. And it doesn't have to be all these discussions on social media. Stereotypes are a lot older than this. So they lead to negative judgment, and they're usually based on value judgments. So not on own experience or on scientific facts, but just on hearsay, something you saw, something you read, something you heard, and you never really questioned if the information you were given was true. So the whole thing, the whole discussion we have these days about fake news, there is a very similar discussion going on when we think about stereotypes, of course, and unconscious bias. So, which for me is then the culture trap. If we think in stereotypes, and we are aware that stereotypes are pretty misleading, then the biggest risk is that when we deal with an individual from a certain culture, doesn't even have to be a country, then we ascribe the same kind of attributes to that individual, so we already block any kind of open-minded communication with that person. So what we need instead is something that I call interpersonal skills and transcultural skills. And for me, the individual is the enemy of the stereotype. And this is something that's very difficult to get across in intercultural studies, because on the one hand, we work with these kind of mentalities. We try to understand how people in other countries think. And when I send people to work in China or to work in the UK, I'm sure this is all very helpful, but I work with international teams, with teams where we have members from 10 or 12 different cultures. And if I do that, they don't work together. They just getting caught up in their stereotypes and say, oh, that's because he's Indian or that's because he's French. And so they actually sort of paralyze their own collaboration together. And that for me is a very dangerous thing. And this is why I'm very careful about that. So for me, intercultural, just to explain the terms, means between two cultures. Transcultural is when you try to move beyond culture. And interpersonal is then, of course, what happens between two people, or, for example, in a group of people, like my teams that I work with. So, what stereotypes are attribution errors. So what we do is actually we look at a person and we ascribe a certain behavior to the person, and we don't take into account the circumstances, the situation in which that happened. Yeah. So when a woman falls on the streets, you would just say, oh, that's because a woman, she's too stupid to walk, instead of, oh, maybe the road was slippery, maybe it was dark, or something like this. Yeah, maybe the woman was wearing high heels, they just blame it on the high heels. The other thing is that we actually perceive far more consciously those things that confirm our stereotype. It's the psychological principle of illusory correlation. Yeah, so you see you're pregnant yourself, for example, and then you just see pregnant women everywhere. Yeah, you think women are bad car drivers, so you only see the women who drive badly, you don't see the women who drive well. Yeah, so that's a psychological phenomenon, because we tend to ignore things that contradict our perception. Because then, oh, I have to think about it. It sort of like provides a problem, and then things get very difficult. And the last psychological aspect here is this very strange belief in a fair world, which means we think bad things will only happen to bad people and good things will only happen to good people. Exactly. So that's the confirmation bias. Yes. So, and that is how rules are formed, and our perception settles pretty quickly. Now, so just read the 3 words here. So, And what I'm doing here is actually, I give you the end as a background, and I give you weekend and book end. And most people would just pronounce the third word as off end and not offend, because they just connected with the end that they've already seen 3 times. And this is how easily our brain forms rules. Our perception actually gets established. So, which is also a very nice little activity, but also a very challenging one. So now let's look at a case study, which really happened. So this is what one of my students said in a workshop where we had to get this international team to work better together. He said, I can't work with the Indians. And I went like, oh, that's a lot of people you can't work with. And then we had a little chat about this. And what happened was this. So he was an engineer based in Germany. He had lived in India for a while to work for his Indian subsidiary there. He loved it. He was really well liked by his Indian colleagues. But when he came back to Germany, he had to work with 2 Indian people whose working style was totally different from the way he worked. He wanted facts, he wanted clear deadlines, and they knew they couldn't keep the deadlines, but they never told him because they didn't want to keep him unhappy. They didn't realize that he was unhappy because they never said, sorry, we won't meet the deadlines. That's the problem. But what he did was he didn't analyze the situation. He just put it down to, I can't work with the Indians, to the stereotype that Germans and Indians can't work together. And that got me thinking. I was like, that's not really a good idea. So, and we broke it down to the situation, and we worked on this interpersonal skills, and we used a number of tools to do that. So, of course, we started with reflecting on our own culture. That's what I always do with my students. So before we look at other cultures, we think first about what comes to your mind, what are the stereotypes, what comes to your mind, what do you associate with your own culture. Now, in that case, can the people please who are German put their ideas about the German culture in, because that's my culture, and I'm going to show you some pictures. So that is, you can, the others, you can do this in the next round, don't worry. So the people who are based in Germany or who actually are German, can you please put your ideas of what is typically German for you in the chat box? You're very direct. Yeah. Order, punctuality. Yeah, man. Yeah. Oh, we love complaining. We love whining. We're very punctual. We're very reserved, very result focused. Yeah. Okay. We have first world problems. Yeah. We're very bossy. But we're car lovers. Okay. Yeah. We're task oriented. Okay. The glass is empty. Yeah. So it's always half empty, Isabel, for sure. Okay. Yeah. And we adapt to non-native speakers, actually. Yeah. Okay. So I show you, so I just ask people really to quickly write down 3 things. And then, of course, we compare in the group. And then I show them my pictures. So this is the first thing that comes to my mind when I think of Germany. I think of football and beer. This is also has to do with the region where I live. Then perfectionism, chaos, German style, and, also, of course, car lovers, German engineering. That's something we are very famous for, but I love all your ideas in the chat box too. So the performance over relationships, for example, yes, I think there's a lot of really good ideas in there. And a lot of that is true. It's a kind of general mentality, but of course it's not true for all Germans. I have friends who are virtual deadline killers. You invite them for 8 o'clock for dinner and they come at 9. So I learned to invite them actually for 7 o'clock and then we can have dinner at 8. So that was my learning curve with them. So the next step that I do then is I ask my students to research how our culture, German culture, is seen by others. And this is just a snapshot of some news I found over the last couple of weeks. So there's always the case of Schadenfreude, yeah, that's kind of glee when the British go like, yeah, Germany is doing economically very well, but they have more food banks than the UK. So there's this kind of rivalry. Italy went for, of course, the Nazis, yeah, so the Fourth Reich. We also have in Britain a very similar trope when people look into football, whenever Germany plays England, there's some kind of First or Second World War pictures in one of the tabloids. And of course, there are things like, for example, the fall of the German wall, of the Berlin Wall, and the reunification that also played a very important part in the news recently. So, and then of course we move on to the other culture, and in our case, I had to do India because that is what my German student had so much trouble with. So, and this is now a question for all. What are your ideas? What comes immediately to your mind when you think of India? Spirituality, okay. Flexible, not direct. Food, colorful. Chaos. Warm-hearted Bollywood, yeah. Loud music. You are Indian, okay. Okay, I should have said the Indians are not allowed to answer. Religion, traditional, happy people, honking horns, yeah. Good food. The caste system still, yes, and so on. Okay, yeah. So again, then you can just read on the in the chat box. So yeah, fluent in English. Michelle, we come back to that in a minute. Yeah. So, and these are my ideas. So there's of course the Taj Mahal, the colorful colors. There's Bollywood, but there's also poverty. So huge amount of poverty. And that's the three ideas that I usually connect when I think of India. So how this culture is shown then in German media. So yeah, I told you I read media studies, so I always work with what is the media, because this is how we perceive things. We don't really go to India, we filter, and we filter through media. So this has all been pre-filtered for us and either confirms our stereotypes or is totally ignored. So of course, I think you know what this is. This is like the demonstrations against the rapes in India. So we want justice for the rape victims. That also made it to German news. And I should say, India does not play a big part in German news. Yeah, unless they're natural disasters or other things that confirm our stereotype of India as a poor country that needs more development. So so you have the flooding, and then you have some more screenshots. This is about the fake news that caused the lynch mob. So that confirms our stereotype of a chaotic, undisciplined, uneducated country without rules. Then you have here something about that the German Football Association is going to do something for young Indian footballers. And we're going to send more education programs and teachers over. So again, it confirms the German stereotype that India needs this kind of development and political unrest, in our case, Kashmir. When this company hit the German news, everybody was like, huh? Who's that? Well, this company hit the news in Germany in two cases. The first one was when they announced that they would make a car. And German papers and German media were very arrogant about it, because they just laughed at it and went like, that's not a car. So it was sort of like, yeah, that's what Indians think it's a car. It's nothing compared to German engineering. But of course, the car works very well in the Indian market because it's like a tuk-tuk, only safer. So in Britain, we always had this kind of Jaguar and Land Rover, because hardly anybody who buys a Jaguar and Land Rover is aware that this company is owned by Tata, one of the largest business conglomerates, especially in industrial manufacturing. And a couple of years ago, Germany's biggest steel company, ThyssenKrupp, was in discussions with Tata about a merger, and I had to tell my students at ThyssenKrupp who Tata is, and they couldn't really understand how an Indian steel company could dare to take over a traditional German industrial giant, who is actually not a giant any longer, and actually would have been better if Tata had bought them. Yeah, because all of these things sort of like contradicted the stereotypes and had to be put back into stereotypical thinking, but this is a way to start. So then we do the other thing. So because we have a look at how do the Indians actually view Germany? So, of course, there's a lot about German technology, and that Germany brings this kind of technological development and has innovative ideas, for example, for certain technical issues. But, and this is my favorite, German engineering sells very well in India. And what you see here is the advert of the German fridge and white goods manufacturer Liebherr. Yeah? So you see the Liebherr fridge here, and then it says, engineered in Germany, designed for India, and they tell the Indians how great they are. And if you look closely, you basically see here an IKEA kitchen in the back, and you could just replace this Indian-looking family with any other family. So it's a global advert, just tailored a bit to the Indian market, but it seems to be a very popular brand with the richer people in India. So India also became far more self-confident. So they see Germany as actually the next benchmark. Yeah? So they actually overtook France in terms of GDP. They're very close to the UK, you know, the old colonial owner. And so the next step is really Germany. That's what they're heading for. And they're possibly going to make this. Yeah? And Germany is also at the same par level, at the same par when it comes to studying somewhere. So it's not only Canada and the US, it's actually Germany, because they can go and study with their degree in an exchange program. So that's quite an interesting way of seeing things slightly differently. So, which takes us back to another misunderstanding between one of my German students who has a C1 level of English. And she works with an Indian colleague who lives in London and has actually a C2 level of English, but uses a lot of slang and idiomatic expressions. And after a workshop I did with my German student, she said, you know, and she speaks really bad English. So I get all these funny WhatsApp messages from her, like home at last and lucky me. And that's not good English. That's not complete sentences, is it? And I went like, but that's very idiomatic. That's very natural English. And then I learned that, like, just because she thinks Indians are not so well educated, the English of her colleague simply cannot be good enough. If she had been sent these messages from an English colleague, yeah, so a lovely lady from Oxford, she would not have had the same response. Yeah? But the stereotype really negatively affected her collaboration with her colleague. Similar case happened with an engineer of mine who does not have a high level of English himself, but he had to communicate with an Indian colleague, and the Indian colleague said, "Zpuntu." Now, please put in the chat box what you think, which number, which figure was the Indian colleague talking about? "10, okay? 0.2, yes, that's the correct answer. Good. So, but Scylla has a certain advantage, I would say, looking at the name. Yeah. So it was actually 0.2. And of course, my student was smart enough to simply ask him, can you write down the number? Yeah. But again, it was this, oh, his English is so bad because he's Indian. It wasn't about, oh, I don't understand his accent or my English is bad or whatever. So they just transferred the stereotypical view of the poor Indians to their colleagues in very high professions with a very high level of professionalism, because professionalism didn't fit the stereotype. So, and that is where stereotypes really hinder effective collaboration across cultures and across borders, because they shape the way we perceive another person. When we hear something that we don't understand, we go, poor English, poor education, typically India. And this is exactly what happened in these two cases. So, and it just confirms our stereotype, because German companies offshore menial jobs to India. So the lower paid jobs, the boring, dull, routine chores that Germans don't want to do any longer. Yeah? That these people have a university degree, that Tata is the world leader in steel, that's no concern to my German students. And of course, you could say that's just another stereotype. Now, I want you to look at a little video. I think we have time for that. And this is a video from the HSBC series with which this bank advertised its global style of doing business in the 1990s. I apologize for the quality. You won't have the sound, but the sound isn't too important. It's just a lot of Indian music as soon as it happens. So what you see out the video to the end. So put your answers in the checkbox. So there's exposure, experience, satisfaction, welcoming the person, he's happy. Exactly, he explores. He looks at things, he's curious, And of course, he goes first to the laundry because this is where he expects the washing machine to be. And then he finds out, and this is a real story because they did this in the Punjab in northern India. I know this from one of my Indian colleagues. He finds out that his machines are used to make perfect lassi. They're top loaders, yeah. So they have a very good kind of like turning around rhythm. Yeah, and that's actually, yeah, so to a certain extent, there is a kind of rewiring because he looks at things differently. So he makes the journey to there. And the thing is, you won't know it until you try it. And there's a link later on. If you go on YouTube and you just Google HSBC intercultural adverts, you get the whole catalog. There are 12 of them. They're all about intercultural misunderstandings, about stereotypes, expectations. They're funny. They're good fun, they're poor quality, but that is also great material to use if you haven't done that already. So, oops, okay, sorry. Yeah. So, because what he does is he follows the formula of what I call the aura formula. So it means that actually you need to combine observation and reflection to build awareness. And that's the way to challenge stereotypes and to get beyond them. So, question is, what are we doing? What are they doing? You always start with a we question. If you leave your learned cultural perspective, you might actually enjoy this. There are a lot of things about my two other cultures, which is Scotland and Sweden, that I enjoy far more than about my home culture, which is German. So the next step is then you have to, if something happens, you have to ask, why did that happen to me? Was there anything at my end that went wrong or that could have been better? So you should always reflect on your interpretation of the behavior. What it means to you doesn't mean the same thing to another person. And of course, you need to be open-minded. So, and one of the tools that I use, for example, is the business advice. This is an activity where you set up a scenery and you ask your students to give business advice about their own country. Yeah, so you have like a company that's taking over a company in your country and your culture. What should they pay attention to? How important are titles? How important is small talk? How important is going out for lunch, gifts, and so on? And you have a great discussion because people go for the conventions, but they also say, but things are changing. Yeah? So you usually get a very good dynamic discussion, and that's a very good observation of your own culture. Another one, which is something I borrowed from two colleagues of mine, Lee Garnsworth and Anita Rowe, who do a lot of diversity work in the States, is also that you write down behavior. Yeah, you can also read this up in the culture map and other kind of cultural guides. And then you ask your students, what does it mean to you? But what does it maybe mean to another person? Yeah, you can also make this a kind of game where they have to act out the behavior, yeah, and see how they feel if you ask them to leave the comfort zone, for example. And so that is also actually a very great exercise and very easily adapted to your own environment. So what I think is very important here is then that you need to learn, and your students need to learn, to avoid cross-cultural pitfalls. So this idea with observe, reflect, then respond, but also learn to respect and accept that things are different, full stop, are very useful. And of course, we shouldn't assume. And instead of all the cultural differences, try to get your students to work for the common ground. And if you're familiar with this, there is a Gallup poll about the Global Emotions Report. So what they did, they went to all the different countries and nationalities and then looked at what emotions are important, what emotional values matter to people. And if you read this, you will see there's more that actually people have in common than that separates them. And that is also a great research tool that you can do with your students. Yeah, and just ask them to research a special nationality or culture and then compare where are their overlappings with your own culture. So for example, this is something I do with my students. It's called a cultural value game. I write each value on a card. I give the card to somebody else, to one of the students, and the other students have to stand closer to the student the more important the value is. Yeah, so for example, if money isn't important, they stand far away. Which value of these 7 values do you think is the one where everybody stands very, very close together? Put your answers in the chat box. What do you think is the most important value? Family, exactly. Yes. Yeah. And it doesn't matter where my students are from. With family, they all start huddling together. And it's so easy then to show them that you share things with others and you shouldn't only think about the stereotypes all the time. Yeah. Because there isn't a superiority. If people have to work successfully together, then they have to see, okay, their differences, individual success in German culture maybe versus team success in Japan, but we also know team success is also very important in Germany, otherwise the football team doesn't win. And then they have the common ground in the family. So, and like the Gallup poll, yeah, it depends on what family life is like, Patrick, I agree. And of course, we have a lot of people who don't like, for example, their biological family, but they recreate often their own family. They want to have something like a family-like structure. So they find substitute parents or substitute siblings or something like this. So a lot of my friends, I consider them to be part of my family, actually. Yeah. And then we have, so similar to the emotions report by Gallup, there's also the World Values Survey, and that works very similarly to find out what you actually have in common with other people. So again, tools you can easily adapt in your own training. So then another one I borrowed from Gardens, Words and Row is actually the circles of culture. So I show my students an onion, and I say there are layers of culture, and in the middle is you. The layers of culture, I usually let them guess, but we don't have time for this, are the different levels, starting very locally with your friends and family and ending up at a very global level. And correspondingly, you have the factors of influence. Again, we don't have time to guess them, but I can show you. Yeah? So these are things and people that influence us. Yeah, so internet and religion at a global level, families and friends or hobbies and interests at a local or subcultural level. And then I get my students to interview each other on their influences. Yeah? Because what they then find out is that they rather look something like this. Yeah? So these are my cultural layers, these are my cultural roles. So I usually draw circles on the flip chart and really write this down and I explain them. Yeah? So I'm somebody who is very regionally shaped because all my life when I lived in Germany, I've lived in the rural area, which is a working class area with a very direct style of communication. So I'm also a wife. I'm an aunt and I'm a daughter. Yeah? And as I said, my two guest cultures is also very important because I love Scotland. I have my own island in Sweden, and then I have my professional roles. For example, I'm a business English trainer, and I'm an intercultural trainer. And I also have I'm a big football fan, so that's also something that shapes my behavior and my interests. I think brain network and physiology certain plays a part, but I think the problem is rather that we need to work on getting things into the conscious level, that people are more aware of what's going on in their brain, how things connect, and how they can shape certain things. Dortmund, Heike, Dortmund. So my husband, however, is a Schalke supporter. So that's the two local rival clubs here in our area, Schalke or Dortmund. So we are pretty settled in the family. And you see, it's a challenge to be the wife of a Schalke supporter when Dortmund is your own club. So that's for the people who are into German football here. That's a very cultural reference. Okay, so, and this is why I really tell my students, stereotype, I teach a lot of German male engineers. The stereotype is they don't do small talk. Unfortunately, the stereotype is right. But when I teach them to make small talk strategic, to explore the other person, what you said earlier, to check wavelengths, to share more than work details, to build common ground in relationships so that it's easier to do business with people, they see that the other person has a lot of different roles, that they have overlaps, they have things in common, and it's no longer, I can't work with the Indians, but my colleague Ranjit has a problem, and I want to help him. So the attitude changes, and that's something that's actually very important. So the last tool that we're going to look at is actually then critical incidents. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but critical incidents is usually a misunderstanding that happens. And the way I do it is there are two sides to every story. I I teach them actually, oh sorry, that's a question. How do you teach unaware engineers to check wavelengths? Well, I make it a structural exercise. I make it an engineering exercise. I say it's a bit like a car. If you want to know what the car looks like inside, you have to dismantle it, you have to ask questions, you have to check what's going on with the car. And they understand that. So, but you have to use a language that engineers can understand. So in our case here, it was a situation between one of my best friends in Glasgow and me about 20 years ago. I was on a visit to Glasgow and I asked him, shall we meet on Tuesday? And he said, if you like. And we met on Tuesday, but we didn't have a very good meeting because this is what he was thinking. Yeah? So that he would really long that day and so on, but he didn't tell me. So I thought he wants to meet on Tuesday, fine. And he went like, she should just guess, yeah, from me saying, if you like, yeah, that I'm not so happy. And it was like, typically German, typically Scottish, or is it just a misunderstanding of communication? And then I also started working on this. That say, oh, maybe I asked too directly. And he learned, maybe I should have just said, don't have time on Tuesday. What about Thursday? Because then we could have just done this differently. Yeah? So critical incidents are usually very good when you deal with stereotypes because the stereotypical perception is what shapes people's minds. It's a very good idea to use real life incidents because they're just more credible. And it can really help people to reveal how they apply their own cultural filters and and it helps to challenge stereotypes. So, for example, I give you a minute to read this. What I do is I prepare 2 cards. So it's 2 sides to every story. Both cards are written from the person's first perspective. So it's the first person narrative and it's their view. There is no judgment. There's only their view on the situation. I don't want to judge. I want them to find out what is the root cause of this misunderstanding. Yeah, so for Monica, now she has these doubts about if the Indians are able to do the job, and she's not happy that they never come to the canteen and so on. And then they always nod, yeah, and she takes this to be a yes, I understood. And the other person also has a view and a perspective. So, and that is Anik, who works for the Indian service provider, and she has very strong views also on the Germans. None of them are making mistakes. They're not doing something wrong. It's just their stereotypical view of the situation, applying their own cultural filters. So what I do in the first round is I deal out the cards and the people have to find their counterpart and then they have to start analyzing this together. They have to look at both perspectives, but they really have to take the perspective. And sometimes that means you leave your comfort zone, you change your cultural role. So, and that is something that's very important because you can't say any longer, this is what it must mean because it means that to me. You really have to think about what does it mean to the other person. Yeah? Emotions are okay, people can be unhappy, but you shouldn't start judging. And there's a whole list of critical incidents and how to use them. And they can also be a great tool in the classroom if you follow up then with what could both people have done differently, how could you make sure that these kind of incidents don't happen in the future. Yeah? So this is another video from the HSBC rule about an Englishman who goes for dinner with his Chinese colleagues and always eats up. And the Chinese think he's still hungry and he doesn't understand that it's actually more polite to leave something on the plate. And this is another one of the HSBC examples. So there are 3 sides to every story, his, theirs, and the one in the middle where this kind of eureka effect finally comes up. Yeah. So if an incident happens, we usually have 4 levels of influence: personal, professional, cultural, and communicative. And very often the stereotypical perception is at stake too. Yeah. So we come to the end of this. So Steve, I really just need 3 minutes, believe me. So and then I hand over to you. Yeah, the eel video is brilliant, Rosemary. I fully agree. Yeah. There's a question here. How about if small talk is very culturally bound, like the one in Britain? Yes, I think here we don't talk about small talk and the idea of, have you seen this TV show last night? So we talk about small talk, maybe about food, about where the people live, about their hobbies, about their interests. It's exploring the other person. So you have to teach small talk slightly differently. So it's not what you can check up on with people from the same culture, unless we all happen to have watched the latest Star Wars movie or something, which is something you can find out. There are, of course, global cultural references like football or Star Wars that might work with people from other cultures as well. So thank you, that's a very good question. Yes, so stereotypes. That is what Black people get to hear in the United States. The first one actually does reflect the white LAPD officers' life, because there are a lot of Black drug dealers in the US, and if they reach into their pocket, you don't know if you're going to get shot or not. But are all Black people living in the US, in LA, drug dealers? Of course not. Yeah? But his view, his stereotypical perception actually means that we have a lot of dead Black people in the US who got shot for just being at home, lying in bed, yeah, leaving a shop. Yeah? So if you're not familiar with this, the We Are Here is the video that the singer, Alicia Keys, put together with a lot of other people, and they just read out, you're shot in America if you do one of these things. But we also have these positive stereotypes, right? All the Black people are great singers and dancers. Now, I don't mind the Blacks, they're always great sports people. And stereotypes can also be positive stereotypes, but they're just as bad and as limiting as the bad stereotypes. And the video is also a great one to start discussion, for example, about race and racial stereotypes, especially when you look at the situation in the US at the moment. So, which takes us to another thing that I did at SIETAR Dublin, the SIETAR Europa conference a couple of years ago, because this is, of course, one of the biggest stereotypes we have at the moment in Europe, especially in Northwestern Europe, the stereotype of the immigrants who are all lazy, who just come here to rape our women and kill people and steal our jobs and have no whatsoever. The stereotype hasn't changed in the last 50 years. Whenever there's a wave of immigrants, the same prejudice, the same stereotypes come up. And here are two exercises how to challenge this. Because you see here four men, who all are the same phenotype. Blonde, white, different kinds of age, okay, but obviously quite well dressed, hopefully well educated. I have my doubts about some of them. Yeah? And then you just ask, who of them is an expert? Who of them is a refugee? Who of them is a native regarding the country that they live in? And who of them is a migrant? So, and the interesting thing is, he's the refugee. Nigel Farage's family came from France. They're Huguenots who were persecuted for religious purposes. He's the guy who's about immigration and refugees. Wonderful. His family is a migrant family. So his grandfather moved to the US. He's of German origin. He is actually an expert because Bastian Schweinsteiger, a former football player, went to the US to play football there. And at that time, he was an expert playing in Dortmund, but he would actually be a native Italian. Doesn't look like one, right? So again, you can use pictures like this to challenge stereotypes and perceptions and what people expect and start a discussion in your classroom. I also do it with this picture because that's, again, a football player, Antonio Rüdiger. And when I ask my students, if they don't know him, how to label the picture, most of them go for refugee. None of them goes for native German, expat because he plays in Italy. Yeah? So actually, he's never seen as half white. Yeah? His father is white German. He's always seen as half Black because his mother is from Sierra Leone. Yeah? And sometimes life is that simple, or maybe not. So, how to change? We have to start challenging stereotypes. Facts, unfortunately, are not enough because emotions are at stake too. And we have to start rewriting the stereotype, showing that people have individual stories, finding common ground, and creating emotional bonding between people if they're going to work together across cultures and across differences. This is something the German magazine Der Spiegel did. I think that's more or less my last slide. So they actually took the stereotype, greedy, threatening, avaricious, dangerous, uneducated, and criminal, and put something else against it. Greedy doesn't mean poor. Maybe he's threatened in his country. Maybe he's simply hungry. Yeah. Maybe he was tortured. She was suppressed in a country and he was persecuted. And this is something they put up, I think, quite a while ago with a wave of immigrants in the 1990s. But I think this is also something that's still true. So I hope that was some food for thought. Sorry for racing through, but you get the slides, you get the instructions, you get my ideas on this. And if you want to read up on this, I can recommend the book Blind Spot, Hidden Bias of Good People, because none of us, including me, is free from bias or free from stereotypes. Thank you very much for your contributions, for your questions, and for listening.
Kirsten, thank you so much for that wealth of resources and experience and references that you provided us. Really incredible. One phrase that you mentioned early on that's going to stick with me for a long, long time, I'm sure, is when you said that the individual is the enemy of stereotypes. I'm really going to take that to heart. You're getting a lot of thank yous in the chat. Before we wrap up, I am going to launch a poll to get some feedback from you folks. While you're doing that, a couple of announcements from the SIETAR side. First of all, our next webinar is on January 22nd. The title of it is Level Up Digital Games as an Effective Medium of Intercultural Skills Acquisition. And that is being led by Elena Shilikovchuk. Sorry for stumbling over that name. Also, in the next few days, watch for the announcement of the program of the cross-cultural coffee breaks for 2020. And finally, as Kirsten has mentioned, this recording will be uploaded to YouTube, and in the comment section of the YouTube posting, we will include links for the resources that Kirsten mentioned. So her slide deck with the notes, the references that she has provided us. So be on the lookout for that over the next couple of days. If you have any other questions, the email address is up there on Kirsten's last slide. You can write to us at webinars@sietareu.org. And with that, I thank you again very much for your attention, for your interest. Kirsten says thank you. Lots of thank yous and happy I made it. We are very happy that you made it, and we wish you a good rest of the day and a brilliant end to 2019. See you all in January. Take care, everyone.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Take care, everyone. Happy Hanukkah, Christmas, whatever festivities come up, and a great start in 2020. See you there.
Thanks, Kirsten.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.